The fabled mystery of female American aviation innovator Amelia Earhart is one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th and 21st centuries. It has captured the imagination of amateur sleuths and so-called experts for decades. So many speculations and assumptions have been put forward as to what actually happened to her and her navigator, Fred Noonan. In news that was published in mainstream UK media on the 30th of July 2018, Ric Gillespie, the Executive Director of the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, says he has proof that finally solves the mysterious disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Firstly, let's recap what we already know about the case. On July 2nd, 1937, during an attempt to make a circumnavigational flight of the globe in a Lockheed Model 10E Electra aeroplane, Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan disappeared over the central Pacific Ocean near Howland Island. The United States Coast Guard ship Itasca, which was stationed at Howland Island, was acting as a picket ship that would provide air navigation and radio links for Earhart. The ship tried to keep in radio contact with her, but due to a series of misunderstandings or mishaps, two-way radio contact was never established. 1 hour after Earhart's last recorded message, the Itasca undertook an ultimately unsuccessful search north and west of Howland Island, based on initial assumptions about transmissions from the aircraft. The United States Navy soon joined the search, and over a period of about 3 days, sent available resources to help find Earhart and Noonan. Later search efforts were directed to the Phoenix Island south of Howland, and a week after the disappearance, naval aircraft from the Colorado flew over several islands in the group, including Gardner Island, which had been uninhabited for over 40 years. The subsequent report on Gardner read, "Here, signs of recent habitation were clearly visible, but repeated circling and zooming failed to elicit any answering calls from possible inhabitants, and it was finally taken for granted that no one was there." A number of hypotheses were put forward that suggested they crashed and sank as the aircraft ran out of fuel, that they were inhabiting Gardner Island, which is a supported hypothesis through the evidence of the search and rescue operations conducted by the Navy, or even that they were captured by the Japanese. A common criticism of all versions of the Japanese capture hypothesis is that the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands were considerably distant from Howland Island. To reach and land there would have required Earhart and Noonan, though low on fuel, to change their northeast course as she neared the island and fly hundreds of miles northwest, a feat that is not supported by the basic rules of geography and navigation. Additionally, had the Japanese found a crashed Earhart and Noonan, they would have had substantial motivation to rescue the famous aviators and be hailed as heroes. Ric Gillespie believes he has proof that Amelia crash-landed on Gardner Island and called for help for nearly a week before her plane was swept out to sea. Gillespie, who has researched the case for more than 30 years, says that Earhart's distress calls were heard around the world and prompted the Navy to launch a rescue mission. He told CBS News that it took the battleship a week to get there, by which time the radio signals had stopped, and when the planes flew over the island, they didn't see an airplane. Gillespie also said the calls were heard by dozens of people who unexpectedly picked up Earhart's transmissions on their radios thousands of miles away. A 15-year-old girl listening to her radio in Florida at the time apparently heard the following dire messages: "Water's high, water's knee deep, let me out, and help us quick." Some of these reports of transmissions were later determined to be hoaxes, but others were deemed authentic. Bearings taken by Pan American Airways stations suggested signals originating from several locations, including Gardner Island. It was noted at the time that if these signals were from Earhart and Noonan, they must have been on land with the aircraft, since water would have otherwise shorted out the Electra's electrical systems. Sporadic signals were reported for 4 or 5 days after the disappearance, but none yielded any understandable information. Gillespie's organisation also re-examined bones first discovered in 1940 after they were found on Gardner Island, where Amelia most likely lived out her final days as a castaway stranded in the middle of the Pacific. Despite speculation that the remains were those of Earhart, British authorities rejected the claim after a doctor concluded that the bones were from a male. The bones were subsequently lost, but the doctor's files were uncovered in 1998 and included the skeletal measurements, which showed that the length of the forearm was larger than average. The aircraft recovery group has now re-examined the doctor's findings with the help of Jeff Glickman, a forensic imaging specialist. He compared the ratio of the skeleton's upper and lower arm bones to that from a clear photograph of Amelia standing in a short sleeve top and concluded that the two ratios were virtually identical. In conclusion, it is almost certain that Amelia and Fred lived out their final days stranded on the tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Considering that Gardner Island had been uninhabited for 40 years at the time of their disappearance, then the search and rescue operation found recent evidence of habitation on the island, gives us a very strong indication that this was most likely their fate. Then there is also evidence from bones that were found but subsequently lost that indicate the ratios were almost identical to Amelia's. Although having DNA analysis would have been far more helpful to determine who exactly they belonged to. Perhaps the bones could have even belonged to Fred Noonan. After all, the initial summary of the bones concluded they belonged to a man. Taking all the current evidence, along with the radio transmissions and the last known location of Amelia and Fred into consideration, we can safely say that this mystery is solved.